This video is going to explore the idea of the age of discovery, or that age in which Europeans were discovering the rest of the world. I'm also calling this Columbusing 101. If you're not familiar with that term, Columbusing, thanks Urban Dictionary, is the art of discovering something that isn't actually new. So come with me on this journey as we understand the global and historical context of worldwide exploration and why Columbus is actually not that great. So 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Not exactly. I mean, he did sail in 1492, and the romance is certainly that he discovered the new world, and after him, Europe discovered the rest of the world. But does that reflect our reality? Not so much. Let's remind ourselves the trade between the Mediterranean and the Far East was hardly new. These are some trade routes that existed prior to Columbus, and we're going to look at how they were established by layering some other historical maps on top of this. So don't forget that before we even begin connecting Europe to Asia, we've got Austronesian maritime spice routes that are actually from the Stone Age, right? Austronesian people originated up here in Southeast Asia and migrated through these archipelagos down to Australia. Australia's Aboriginal population is the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, 50,000 years old. And these folks are seafarers. So they've established these trade routes long ago for Europeans to then come on and pick up on as we move into later eras. Europeans also benefit from the Chinese trade routes across Central Asia, which were consolidated by the second millennium BCE. So second millennium before the Common Era means first is 0 to 1000, and the second is 1000 to 2000 BCE. Long time ago. Europe is still not even a thing yet. Then, after China establishes this, we have the Persian Royal Road during the Persian empires, and that controls that area that we call the Middle East today. So that's Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the far eastern end of the Mediterranean. These are all connected, and this is a central point in the trade networks that brings China into contact with the Mediterranean. Alexander the Great comes on the heels of the Persian Empire. The Macedonian Empire establishes this cultural exchange. So even though Alexander's empire doesn't last very long, the impact of his conquest was Hellenism, which is this whole era of Greek-based cultural exchange throughout this region. Because it established a lingua franca, if you will, a lingua greca in the region, all of these different cultures were able to exchange ideas and grow and mesh and learn from each other. So this was a real flowering of intellectualism in the Eastern Mediterranean and this Central Asia, Near East region. And that is still before the Common Era, right up until the Common Era, because next up we of course have Rome. Right? And Rome just before the Common Era and into the early CE centuries, they maintain these trade routes. So Rome doesn't control all of this region, that's for sure. But what we see in this map is all of the commodities that Rome had access to because it controlled this access point on the Eastern Mediterranean, right? Rome was all around the edge of the Mediterranean, and because of that, it had access to all of these other trade routes. So without controlling all the territory, they have access to all the trade. And Rome, after it falls apart in the 4th-ish century CE, depends on how you define the fall of Rome, the eastern half of the Roman Empire continues to exist and becomes the Byzantine Empire. And as the Byzantine Empire grows, it also takes over that trade control of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it expands territory into the east. Not as far as some empires, but pretty far. Right? It controls all this access to these trade and spice routes because it controls both the overland route that goes through Central Asia and the route that would go by sea if you go through Egypt, right? You take your boat all the way up the Nile, you have a little bit of an overland track, and then you hit the Red Sea here, and you've got boat all the rest of the way to Southeast Asia. Then, after the Byzantine Empire starts to decline, you have the rise of a new power, which is the Islamic Caliphate, which becomes its own form of an empire. Now, what you see in this map is its expansion under Muhammad, that's in the Arabian Peninsula, and then the patriarchal expansion under the first 4 rightly guided caliphs, and finally the Umayyad expansion that extends all the way into Iberia, which is modern-day Spain, and all the way east into Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? So you see a lot of expansion of the Islamic Caliphate, which of course is going to mean that the Muslim traders, even after the Caliphate falls apart, this Muslim-controlled region becomes the point of access to all of the trade routes. That includes the overland route through Central Asia and the by sea route that has to go through Egypt. So these are the trade routes that exist, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that by the 9th century, we also have to add Vikings to this mix, right? Vikings are the first European globalizers. Notice, they come from these northern regions, and all these pink routes, these are all Viking routes. And we actually see testimony of this in the writings of Islamic travelers who encounter northern Europeans on their travels, right? They're these Northmen that are actually pretty gross compared to the Islamic travelers. They don't bathe and they don't understand hygiene and stuff. Ibn Fadlan writes about how grotesque they are. It's pretty awesome. But the key thing to remember here is that Vikings go everywhere. There are Viking items and artifacts all over the world. And you can find artifacts from all of these different places in Viking occupied regions. So Vikings, they were everywhere. And this map doesn't show it, but not only did they get to Iceland and Greenland, but they landed in North America as well. So if you're interested in that, follow up with the Vinland sagas. Meanwhile, we don't want to forget that there are connections between the Asian world and the Americas. They're just not covered a lot in history because they happen across the Pacific. And let me tell you, there were years and years and years, centuries, in which scholars would tell you that it was impossible for anyone to have arrived in the Americas via the Pacific Ocean because it was so huge. Incorrect. Polynesian wayfinders had definitely made their way to South America and interacted with indigenous peoples there. And we know this from multiple strands of evidence. And what you're seeing on this slide is actually, you see one form of evidence in the human genetics, in the human DNA. We know for sure that Polynesians and South Americans met, married, and made babies. We also know this from sweet potato DNA. Yes, that's right. Sweet potato from the Americas made it into the Polynesian islands and spread throughout Southeast Asia from Polynesia. And what's really interesting about this is that these two DNA trails of evidence don't follow the same path, which suggests there was more than one contact, right? This isn't just like a one-off chance. This means that these people had interaction in more than one instance and in more than one way, probably. So Polynesians and Austronesians are connecting all across the Pacific. That is happening right up through the European Middle Ages. So by the time that the Vikings are landing in Newfoundland, we've got Polynesians encountering indigenous South Americans. But also, let us not forget that trade routes existed in the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans, right? So this is a great map on the left of all of the different regions, cultural regions of the pre-Columbian Americas, several of which were quite civilized. They had major hierarchical, stable civilizations. Some of them were nomadic. But lots of them had really complex trade networks. Although I will critique this map because you'll notice that the trade networks only go so far as the modern day United States, right? Like, oh, these people didn't trade anywhere because nothing was down here. Actually, no, that's not true. This was the center of civilization in North America. Everything north of Panama was influenced by the center of civilization in Mesoamerica. Like, there are no other giant cultural centers until you finally get the Mississippians up here. So very weird that this map just cuts off right here. Also very weird that we don't include the extensive indigenous peoples of what is today Canada, the Athabascans and the Inuit, who occupied this region in very interesting ways that were also involved in this trade network and connected in a different way. So we have lots of evidence of these trade networks. Seashells from the coast of California would end up in the Mississippi River Valley. Like, these were extensive trade networks, and these indigenous people relied on their ability to trade and barter to get everything that they needed to maintain their lifestyles. But meanwhile, so we've talked about the Pacific, we've talked about the Vikings, we've talked about the pre-Columbian trade networks. Now we also have to acknowledge what is happening in Central Asia around the same time, which is the Mongol Empire, right? That's really expanded, most notably by Genghis Khan. And it expands all the way east into Europe, like right there at the edge. And so all of those spice routes that were overland that Europe relies on for things like cinnamon and cloves and peppers and tea. Tea's not a thing yet. That's British Empire. All of those things that the overland route provides to Europe, these are now all controlled by the Mongol Empire. In fact, by the time that Marco Polo gets around to his travels, I should note his dad has been to Beijing before him. Marco Polo is famous because he writes about it. And even that asterisk on right. The romance writer that he's jailed with in Italy as the city-states are fighting each other, the romance writer listens to his stories and then writes them down. So the reason we know Marco Polo is because of those circumstances in which his travels are written down. Europeans have certainly been to the east before, and one of the reasons that they're able to do that is because the Mongol Empire is relatively stable, and they actually allow Christian missionaries to go on in there, and Marco Polo follows the footsteps of his dad and some Franciscans who have been there before. So by the time that he's made it to Beijing and all the way around Southeast Asia, Europeans are hardly discovering anything new. Right? Polo is actually a guest in the court of the Great Khan, and he writes about Beijing, and he writes back home to Europe. He's like, hey guys, they're a lot like us. They're just a different religion. And Europe is like, yeah, no, we don't buy that. But that is another lecture for another day. Meanwhile, as Europe is dealing with its own drama in the Middle Ages, we have the rise of the Ottoman Empire. Kind of takes over from the collapsed Islamic states. The Ottoman Empire is Islamic, but it is also Turkish. And it lasts a really long time. Look at that. 1922. It doesn't end until the end of World War I. We see here 1566. One of its heights of power, and it becomes the primary connecting polity between Europe and those routes farther east, again, because it controls the access to the overland route and access to the sea route. Important to note, it grows and wanes over time, so it's worth knowing that the Ottoman Empire is a bit in flux. But that's all before we get to European colonization. So I wanted to really highlight the fact that there is a long history of global trade and travel all over by all kinds of other cultures besides European ones before we get to the part where European countries start trying to take over other parts of the world, right? Iberia, that's Spain, leads the way with Spain and Portugal, especially in the New World, but Portugal actually starts in Africa. And Portugal and their papal permissions that they get in the 15th century, so that's the middle of the 1400s, they actually begin the slave trade as we know it. And once Columbus arrives in the Americas, that slave trade becomes transatlantic. So just mental note, lots and lots of exploration and global contact before European colonization. But then, of course, there is European colonization, right? It goes global. It goes everywhere. In fact, one of the key events that changes the way that European colonization works around the world is actually the contest between England and Spain, which at some point is intermarried. They definitely are related. There's Habsburgs in Spain, etc. Elizabeth's older sister Mary is like married to the King of Spain, and then when Elizabeth takes over, that causes all of these religious conflicts because Spain is Catholic and England is Protestant because Henry VIII needs an heir, etc. Right? Lots of history is tied up into this colonization bit. But the key thing you want to know is that British naval supremacy is kind of a freak accident. So Spain is in control of everything. They are fighting with Britain largely on the basis of a religious contest, or at least it's justified as a religious contest, but it may well be a land contest. But Spain sends an armada to invade Britain in 1588, and by some freak hurricane in the Atlantic, all of their ships sink. Like, pretty much all of them. Out of nowhere. Random, right? Because Spain loses the majority of its navy, suddenly there's a power vacuum and the British Navy steps right in. And now the British Navy is the most powerful navy in the globe, in the water, and that is what allows them to become a global empire. So 1492, look where they are, nowhere. And as you watch these dates, 1660, they're all over the globe, right? And then as we move on forward from the 17th century into the 18th century, not only does their territory grow, but the number of continents that they are accessing starts to increase. And those territories continue to grow throughout the 19th century. By Victorian period, it's going to be huge. Look at that, 1885. They're all over the place. But it's still going to grow, especially when you get into the 20th century with World War I, and then the settlement of World War I, those treaties actually give them more territory around the globe. And that doesn't change really until the end of World War II brings about decolonization. So there's a little bit less. They're losing some territory in some places. They get some from the end of World War II and those treaties. And then they start to decolonize, right? So decolonization begins and those territories wane until it goes right back around to mostly just what we know today, Britain. But then there was Hong Kong for a long time and the Falkland Islands. And voila, British Empire. This is where we will end though. So for global context, let us remind ourselves that the entire globe, except for 5, that is 5 individual countries, was at one point either colonized directly by Europe, or controlled by Europe, or strongly influenced by Europe, right? So there are a handful of countries, which is Mongolia and Iran today, Persia in the past, Iran, Persia, and some Central Asian countries weren't under direct control, but were heavily influenced by European power. And only a handful of actual countries never were colonized by Europe or European powers, right? And that includes Thailand, partly because they were a buffer between British interests over here and French interests over here, French Indochina, the Koreas, North and South, Japan, and we're going to count this tiny little slice of Africa here. This is called Liberia. And the only reason you can say that wasn't colonized is because the United States backed the establishment of an African colony for the repatriation of enslaved Africans or freed blacks who had come to the Americas by way of slavery or their ancestors' enslavement. And lest you think this is a very liberal and noble thing, please recall that a lot of times the repatriation project was just as racist as the slavery project. They just wanted blacks to go away instead of do free labor. So this is all there is. This is all there is of the globe that was not colonized by Europe or controlled by Europe. Gentle reminder that European colonialism has defined our entire world. Thank you for coming on this quick global historical journey with me. This has been produced by InterEd, Intersectional Education, by myself. I am Dr. Bennett, and it is an anti-colonial curriculum resource that is free for use in your classroom. Please don't distribute it in any other way. The concepts in this tool are rooted in forms of academic, cultural, and historical analysis developed by post-colonial theory as well as critical race theory. Particular credit is due to the collective of medievalists of color and their many, many great works doing critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and working on empire in the pre-modern and non-Western worlds. So if you want more of that, please go visit medievalistofcolor.com. This has been InterEd. Thanks for joining us.